amazing to see so many of you all here. There are a few things that I want to say. I think I got to get mic'd up for the camera. Thank you. Yeah, there you go. I'm going to take this off soon, but the reason I'm saying this, the way that this is all going to go, my mentor, my colleague, my friend, my advisor, I guess a mentor and advisor is the same thing, Ann Rawls is going to speak first, and then I'm going to speak second. But before I say that, I want to thank Dr. Joe Trotter for just being exceptionally kind and humble to me and giving with your time. There are a number of times where I call him with emergencies where I need his intellectual advice, and he's always called me back within less than 24 hours. And he's just been gracious in his advice and just providing support. I want to thank Hikari, I don't know where Hikari is right now, who is probably one of the most consistent but also humble and thoughtful administrators I've ever had the pleasure of working with. And sometimes I can be very needy and spoiled, and she has been nothing but kind to me when I ask, like, why can't I do something? And she helped me figure those things out. Now, introducing Ann Rawls. It's hard to talk about a scholar who has multiple academic positions, who's published in every major journal in sociology, top journal in sociology in this country, but also in Europe, with over 5 books, over 35 peer-reviewed articles, numerous grants, and just to say a few. Even reading her credentials, full professor of sociology at Bentley University, a research professor of socio-informatics at University of Siegen in Germany, senior fellow at Yale Urban Ethnography Project, an international advisor for the Center for Fundamental Sociology, Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and associate researcher at the Marcel Mauss Institute in Paris. But what's interesting about this is that this has been a long journey. We've been discussing and talking about a number of the topics that we're going to present to you today for over 20 years. She was my undergraduate advisor, and we've stayed friends and collaborators all that time. So without further ado, I give you Ann Rawls. Oh. Bitch.
Undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate, right? Yeah.
It's a lifelong commitment.
Yeah. Okay, let's put that. How did they go? Let's do that. Okay. Okay. Well, Waverly didn't explain the painting.
Oh, should I?
So no,
I'll do it.
because I had the same reaction. I said, "Why that painting?" But what we're talking about when we talk about interaction orders of race is a black one and a white one. And Waverly had this painting, which he blames me for because I collect paintings, so he collects paintings. And you have, a black, not just person, but, head, right? And so there's thinking going on, and then there's a white one over here. And so it looked like some kind of very colorful, abstract depiction of what we were talking about today. Okay, so, clicker, I need the clicker. A nation divided, interaction orders of race, the high cost of unconscious racism in everyday life. And I guess I should say this is a book we're working on now. So University of Chicago Press when we get it done in a couple of months. We stand at a crossroads on race. Now is a critical moment for American democracy. We are a nation divided by race. Our failure to deal with our race problem threatens the very core of the American way of life. It is not black and brown people that threaten traditional American values. It is white racism that seeks to voluntarily to trade democracy for dictatorship. Over the last 2 years, we have seen a great undercurrent of hate building since the civil rights movement break out and come to the center of American life. Racism was weaponized by big data factories during the 2016 presidential campaign to exploit divisions between white and black Americans. Bad as the interference in our free democratic process is, however, it would not have worked unless racial hatred and resentment were already there waiting to be used. We all need to take responsibility for the racial hatred, white supremacy, and racial discrimination in America that make it possible to divide us. The only hope for the preservation of our democratic way of life is to overcome white racism toward black and brown people and finally achieve racial equality. But now it looks like this will be our last chance. We have stood at this crossroads before and failed. The possibility of democracy now hangs on what we do. We had the opportunity to end racial slavery in 1776, but we did not. We had the opportunity to end legal racism after the Civil War. Instead, we embarked on a period of racial terror and Jim Crow segregation. We had the opportunity to end the race problem after passing the Civil Rights Bill in 1965, and again, we did not. Instead, we embarked on 6 decades of blaming black Americans and non-white immigrants for every problem in our society: poverty, unemployment, welfare, crime, drugs, and the erosion of traditional culture. Now we have 4 centuries of racism to undo, and a large proportion of white Americans who believe the myth that they are the ones hard done by. If we don't fix this, racial inequality will destroy our democracy. Tacit interactional, look at me. Okay. Tacit interactional racism is a potent enemy. If I do that again, yell at me, okay? The problem is that race in the US has become so deeply embedded in the taken-for-granted structures of interaction that it produces tacit, unconscious forms of racism that happen every day and yet remain hidden. Tacit racism has become institutionalized in the everyday practices of Americans. It is this hidden and routine character of racism that makes it such a potent enemy. We identify a set of interrelated phenomenon we call interaction orders of race, race pollution, fractured reflections, and submissive civility that we hope can provide new ways of understanding the racism hidden in everyday interactions. And I want to stop and say that right now at 5 o'clock at the North Central meetings in Pittsburgh, we're receiving an award for the Fractured Reflections paper, which was Waverly's idea. We got Paper of the Year from North Central for that one. I will introduce interaction orders and race pollution, and then Waverly will take over the discussion of interaction orders and elaborate on fractured reflections and submissive civility, which is an idea of W.E.B. Du Bois, as several of these are. We capitalize the word race, and I also have it in scare quotes, to underscore its arbitrary and social character. In the age of DNA, we now know it has no biological basis. We talk about race using the terms black and white to underscore the dominance of the American black-white racial binary categorization system. We don't talk about racists, but rather racist actions and practices, which every one of us engages in. In our data from interactions between Americans who self-identify as black and white, we find that everyday life expectations differ for black Americans who experience what W.E.B. Du Bois called double consciousness, while white Americans remain unaware of these differences. Because black and white Americans inhabit different interaction orders of race with distinct methods of sense-making, interactions across race often lead to misunderstandings, which reinforces racism. I developed the idea of interaction orders of race as a way of making sense of differences I was finding in data at the level of interaction in 2000. Because it has been necessary for Black Americans to protect and defend themselves from racism, there are important ways in which everyday sense-making practices of Black Americans have become different from those of white Americans. While the white interaction order exposes personal information and promotes competition between legally and socially free and equal persons, the Black interaction order protects personal information and promotes equality and community between those who are legally stigmatized and socially and economically disenfranchised. In many ways, the two interaction orders are mirror opposites. The idea was inspired by Du Bois, an important Black American sociologist who wrote that racism produces an experience of double consciousness among Black Americans. I did it again. See, you got to yell at me. We need a national conversation about race. But in order to have that conversation, there are 4 things we need to do. First, we need to start seeing the subtle forms of racism that are everywhere. Most people know there is some racism, and over the last several years, it has gotten a lot more obvious, for which we have Donald Trump to thank. But most people have no conception of how much tacit racism goes on every day or how serious it is. Second, we need to understand why racism is so hard to see and how the development of clashing interaction orders that results can itself perpetuate racial stereotypes and misunderstandings just about every time people try to have the conversation across race we need to have. Third, we need to understand that as long as racism persists, Black Americans will need their own interaction order so that what people like to call assimilation is not an option. It is racism that leads to the multiplication of interaction orders because it is not safe for everyone to interact in the same way. Fourth, we need to understand that because the Black interaction order developed to create an oasis of equality for people denied equality by society at large, it is fundamentally more egalitarian than the white interaction order, and we have a lot to learn from it. We will need to give up most of the things we believe about race to have this conversation. How to start seeing racism. This first objective is essential. With my students, I adopted the method of asking them to look for the racism in their own lives, and I think it's about 30 years of doing this. To their surprise, when they start looking, they see a great deal of it. Their observations over many years have been assembled into a dramatic production that we hope can ground the national conversation we need to have, and I will show a few clips of that in my presentation. Once we see how much racism there actually is, then we need to understand how it can be so subtle that most people just don't see it. My formulation of race differences in terms of interaction orders is intended to address that issue. In making sense of social life, we interpret what we see and hear using familiar social practices. These taken for granted practices can be hard to see because we use them every day. Anything that is taken for granted becomes, in an important sense, invisible. This has happened both with familiar everyday interaction orders of race and with racism itself. In what follows, I will present observations from students, both Black and white, about the kinds of racism they experience every day on college campuses. The hope is that an understanding of just how thick on the ground the experience of racism is can give white Americans their own experience of racial double consciousness so they can start to see for themselves the deep vein of racism that is fueling the current divisions in our country. The narratives we present are taken from the student observations of race, Black, white, and Asian, observing the racism they experience in their everyday lives. These narratives illustrate how racism manifests itself in the ordinary things people say and do on a daily basis. We present these narratives roughly as they were given to us, editing for narrative flow and changing names and other details when necessary to make them anonymous. As a dramatic device for the production we put together, students switched identities, with black students narrating the observations of white students and men narrating women. The intent is to make racism appear by eliminating the taken for granted that hides it. The racism these students observed has no gray areas. It is about the white insider and the black other, about how being white makes one acceptable and superior while black is bad, broken, stupid, inferior. It is about how being white entitles a shared but thoughtless rudeness. The N-word. We observe some simple rules for these observations and the discussion that follows. We never say the N-word. When N-word appears, it means that in the original observation, the actual word was said. We find that white people seem to enjoy saying that word whenever it can be construed as legitimate, as in reporting about or reading something. We never even write it for that reason. In one observation, to preserve the poetics of spoken language, we wrote N star, 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 R, and enunciate the stars. When black Americans say that word, it affiliates. It means one like me who shares my fate on the black side of the racial divide. When a white person says it, the word is divisive, period. Okay, so this is the first observation. Do you know why there are so few black students at the university? This is a question many white students report overhearing as they move around college campuses. One or more white students who are casually walking across campus will ask this question to each other and say negative things about black intelligence or affirmative action loudly enough for bystanders to hear. Who knows why they do this, but they do. Many different answers to the question have been reported, but they are all racist, as for instance, because they're too stupid to get in, because they have criminal records, because you have to work hard here and they are lazy, because they can't afford the tuition. Sometimes those who overhear such conversations know the students who are talking, and sometimes they don't. Black students don't report overhearing this stuff, although they know their classmates think this way. So it seems to be one of those things white kids may not be consciously aware is racist, but they also seem to be very careful about who is around, and they don't often say it casually around black students, although they will make arguments about this in class. These beliefs are troubling for many reasons, not least of which is that they're false. But what concerns us most is how the same student can hold contradictory racist assumptions and not notice. For instance, that black students can always get into college because of affirmative action, and that black students get all of the scholarships. But if they can always get in because of affirmative action, there would be more black students at the school. And if black students get all the scholarships, tuition would not be a problem. Black kids are given special treatments at all schools. A white female college student named Amy was in the student center doing homework on a Tuesday night. Two white boys sat at a table nearby and started talking about their grades on an exam. What started as a discussion of grades, however, quickly became a discussion of race. Boy 1 asked, "How did you do on the exam?" Boy 2 answered, "Oh, I did okay. I mean, honestly, I could have done so much better, but I had midterms all week. I just didn't have enough time." Boy 1 nodded in agreement and said, "Did you hear what that black athlete got?" Boy 2 said, "No, I know he was bugging about it though." Boy 1 said, "Yeah, he told me last night he failed the exam and that his professor had no sympathy about it." Boy 2 said, "Finally, he doesn't get away with something." After boy 2 said, finally, there was something the black athlete didn't get away with, boy 1 said, what do you mean, get away? Boy 2 said, you know why he got into this school, right? Boy 1 said, yeah, he was recruited just like all the other athletes. Boy 2 said, yeah, but because he's black, they lowered their standards and expectations for him. Boy 1 said, oh, I mean, that's true with any of the black kids here. None of them had to work as hard as the rest of us to get here. Boy 2 said, it's ridiculous. And then he goes to his professors, and because he's black and an athlete, they just boost his grade. Boy 1 said, I just think the black kids in general are given special treatment at all schools, and it's not fair to the rest of us. And they nodded in agreement. There are more contradictory beliefs here. That he didn't get away with it somehow supports the racist belief that he and other black kids always get away with it. Why do white students believe this stuff? Given that Harvard University, year after year, achieves a ratio of 10% African American, not just black, but American black, and that other top universities come close to this ratio, the very low ratio of black students at a modestly rated university cannot be a result of there being no black students smart enough to be accepted by that university. It may be that the university is just not good enough to attract large numbers of the best black students who are in high demand. Black students may not apply to a university if there are few minorities because it may mean that the social climate is unfriendly to minorities. Why don't white students worry that black students are avoiding their university? But it's not one of the things they say. This forces the university to spend more money trying to attract the very same minority students that the white students assume are not good enough to get in and are busy driving away. Racist thinking is adding to the cost of their tuition and detracting from the university's ability to offer them an experience diverse enough to prepare them for the real world of work they are hoping to succeed in. At many colleges, black students make up only 2 to 6% of the student body. The percentage of black students is almost never equal to their percentage in the population, but people still believe that bad students are getting an affirmative action boost. Harvard, which does achieve a 10% black student ratio, routinely graduates a higher percentage of its black students than its white students, between 96 and 98%. That would suggest that black students at Harvard are more than equal to their white counterparts. Where are these racist myths coming from, and why are white students so comfortable with them? It is white students who currently benefit from diversity agendas, C- white men in particular. Asian students are penalized 100 to 140 points on the SAT at Harvard and Princeton, and black and Hispanic students are also often penalized to keep white admissions up. Black students know their white classmates think they don't deserve to be in college, but there's nothing they can do about it. It is in their face every day, and they live with it. It's what we call a fractured reflection of who they are that makes them very uncomfortable. It's one of the things white students and some faculty consider a fact and have little hesitation saying. They feel entitled and not at all apologetic about this. Here we go, another minority speaking for affirmative action. George is a black college student. His observation took place in class during his first semester in college. His professor assigned a project, and George chose the topic of affirmative action. Although he knew his professor had very conservative views and had plenty to say without much of what George called filter, George chose affirmative action because he felt he didn't really know enough about it. According to George, he was getting sick and tired of hearing from white students and friends that you only got into college because you have minority points, or your brother got into college because he's a minority. Even his best friend, who was valedictorian of his high school class, said, well, Sorry, I'm the basic white student. Your cousins only got into the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard because they're black, when George had teased him about not getting into top Ivy League schools. George had started to believe that affirmative action was a form of reverse discrimination because of all the complaints he was hearing from his white friends. However, after doing his class project, George realized that affirmative action just helps disadvantaged people compete. He was eager to present his findings because he thought the professor and many of the students had honestly believed he had been given a seat in the class over a more qualified white student, and that the facts would change their minds. George, by the way, is a straight-A student. As he stood up to give his presentation, the professor said, "Here we go, another minority presenting for affirmative action." Afterwards, the professor asked him, "Do you think it's fair that you get to be here because of affirmative action over a white kid who is more qualified?" George couldn't believe what the professor said. He had decided to ignore the rudeness, but then, George said, it hit him. He realized that his white classmates don't see him as a student who worked hard in high school to get where he is today. No, George said, instead they see me as a product of affirmative action who does not deserve to be where he is. Not only that, he said, the people I'm supposed to look up to and learn from, the professors, see me this way. George says he can't achieve anything because nobody will give him credit for his hard work. He's sick and tired of being looked at as a product of an unfair advantage instead of as a student on campus. All of George's hard work is reflected back to him from his white classmates as if he had not done it. This is a fractured reflection that he does not recognize himself in. Okay, now I got to play this one, so let's see if I can make that work.
I am a white girl with long brown hair, a student athlete and a junior at Bentley University. As an athlete, I'm constantly trying to balance my workout schedule with my studies, which isn't easy. One particular day, as I finished my workout, I realized that I was going to be late for a meeting with several classmates in one of their dorm rooms to work on a group project for class. It was really sweaty, but because I was late, there was no time to take a shower, so I just put my clothes on and ran back to the dorm. When I got to the room where we were supposed to meet, I rushed in and apologized for being late. 3 white female classmates were waiting for me. One of the 3 said, "Oh my God, you're sweaty. You make the room smell like," I quote, "a black people house." No one else said anything. I asked her what she meant by that. I knew I was sweaty, but I was very surprised to hear her say that smelling bad was a characteristic of black people in their houses. She said, you know, black people stink, and their houses stink. In an effort to be diplomatic while also letting her know that I didn't appreciate her comment, I said that I was not aware that black people's houses smelled bad. I wanted to challenge her statement, but her response was that I must have grown up in an all-white town and gone to an all-white school if I didn't know black people smelled bad. This response really surprised me. Then she said that if I didn't understand her, I must have a diversity problem and that I needed to get some black friends so that I could learn that they stink. Can you believe that? She says black people stink, but I am the one with the diversity problem. I even happen to know that she came from an even whiter town than I did and that she does not have black friends, whereas I actually do. I asked her if I blindfolded her and stood people of different ethnicities next to her, if she would be able to identify their ethnicity. She said that she could come really close. Since this happened and we discussed it in class, I have learned that racism often takes this form, coming back at the person who questions it like a boomerang. It's probably one of the reasons we are so reluctant to question racism. but also why it's important to do so. Otherwise, the boomerang will keep flying, good people will duck, and the racism will win.
Did you just say the N-word? A black student named Tracy was in her dorm suite with several white friends. One of them said the N-word. Tracy said, "Did you just say the N-word?" Her white friend replied, "Yes, but it's not racist. It doesn't mean anything." When Tracy continued to ask about this, her friend explained, "Back home, whenever we don't like anything, we call it the N-word. Like if something breaks, we call it the N-word." This is supposed to explain how using the N-word has nothing to do with race. In this case, an overt form of racism is being sheltered by a family practice, such that this white student feels comfortable using the N-word in front of black friends. She explained that she grew up in a home where using this word in a mundane way is a common practice. Therefore, it can't be racist. She is sufficiently unaware of how racist the practice is to give this account to a black friend, and even to complain that Tracy's making a big deal out of nothing when she asked her about it. Black students frequently run into this complaint when white friends are called out for saying something racist. What was the friend really saying? In her family, they all call things they don't like the N-word. If something breaks, if it's an inferior product, a bad thing, if it doesn't work and makes them very angry, all stereotypes for black Americans, they call it the N-word. How is this not racist? The objective of these observations is to get white students to hear themselves, to become self-aware.
I am a white male college student at Bentley University. One night, I was sitting in my dorm room trying to do my homework when my two roommates started a conversation about Bernie Sanders and his current campaign for president. Roommate 1 said, "Bernie Sanders is absolutely killing it. He's getting that black vote for sure." Roommate 2 said, "Yeah, it's because Bernie doesn't give a shit about anything and black people love that. He just does what he wants." Roommate 1 said, "He is the cool old white guy that all the black voters want to be like." My roommates both look at me while I'm typing, as if to try and pull me into the conversation. I don't say anything. I don't want any part of their conversation. Roommate 1 said, Bernie is kind of into hip-hop, and if we know anything about black people, they love their hip-hop and their basketball. Roommate 2 said, "Yeah, didn't you see that video of Bernie shooting hoops? A bold marketing strategy there. He's just trying to get the brothers on board." Both roommates laugh, and again look over at me because I am not laughing. I said, "Really? Is that all they like? So you're telling me that black people are going to vote for Bernie Sanders because he likes hip-hop music and basketball?" At this point, it becomes obvious to my roommates that I'm not interested in taking part in their conversation. They move into the bedroom and continue talking, but they leave the door open, and it is obvious that I can still hear what they are saying. Roommate 1 said, "And don't you think that they are scared of the Republicans? I mean, if I were black, I would be. Who would want a bunch of old white guys telling me what to do, right? We are just rich assholes who run shit."
It's called the Nutcracker, not the nut N star 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 R. A white student named John went to the Nutcracker with his girlfriend Sue and her family. As they drove along, they saw two black women walking along the sidewalk in the direction of the theater. Sue's cousin Bill saw them and said, "Black people going to watch the Nutcracker? It's called the Nutcracker, not the nut N star 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 R." He then laughed, and the other members of Sue's family laughed with him. John couldn't believe it. He said, "Chill, bro, that's messed up. That's not right to say." Bill said, "You're right, bro, my fault." There are several things to note about this observation. First, a white student suddenly found himself in a situation with people he likes who were being overtly racist. This is very common. Because he was thinking about racism, he actually called out his girlfriend's family on their behavior. Usually everyone just laughs, and John said usually he would have too, which confirms the behavior is okay, and it happens again and again and again. Second, how did they find it funny in the first place that two black women were walking to the theater? There is a poetics about Nutcracker and nut and star, 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 R, but Bill had to first see two black women going to the theater as N-words for him to think of the wordplay. How does one see that? What kind of racially segregated life are people living to see human beings as N-words who don't go to the theater, let alone make a racist joke about it? Third, John did something about it that let his girlfriend's family know it was not okay, and this is unusual. Often in the context of overtly racist jokes, people complain about being forced to be politically correct, if you call them out on it, as if such talk would be funny and not damaging to society and its members, that people would just stop asking them to be PC. This family failed to see two black Americans as people.
I am a white male Bentley student, but in this incident, I was mistaken for a black student. At 1 a.m. on a Saturday night, I was talking on my cell phone while I walked across campus. As I walked past one of the dorm buildings, a white guy on the third floor opened his window and started yelling at me. He was trying to get me to turn and acknowledge him. I was wearing sweats and a hoodie with the hood up, and the first thing he yelled at me was N-word. I was stunned. When I didn't respond to him, he kept trying to get my attention. Hey you, and then he yelled, "Hey you, N-word." I still didn't look up at him. But he kept yelling at me, "I know you can hear me, N-word." Then as I walked further away, he began yelling, "Come on, you dirty N-word, give me a look." After he said that, I could hear other students inside the room laughing. I realized that he was showing off for his group of friends and thought about how stupid people can get when they do that. But I was shocked that his showing off would go so far, and I wondered what would have happened if I had actually been black. As it was, I just kept on walking and talking on the phone, moving away and ignoring the comments as they came at me.
Race pollution. The big news is not that there is racism on college campuses. There have been many reports of serious incidents of racism at American universities over the last few years, but this is unfortunately not the big news. The big news is that white students are inundated by racist statements, observations, and jokes from their friends, roommates, and family members that they cannot escape from. We are not talking about an occasional incident, but rather a constant daily downpour of racism that we call race pollution. Our observations suggest that we have greatly underestimated the amount of racism that all students, both black and white, experience on a daily basis. If this is happening in our centers of higher education, we can only imagine how much worse it is elsewhere. Unless white students start paying attention to the racism around them and take action to stop it, they will absorb this race pollution and amplify it. Developing a white double consciousness about race. A national conversation in which we all discuss our observations of the racism in our own lives is long overdue. We propose that developing an awareness of racism will help white people develop their own double consciousness about race. Double consciousness gives people the understanding that there is racism so tacit that only some people involved in an encounter are aware of it. White students who are aware of the tacit racism in social interaction begin to see the racial divide in a way that is similar to how Black people see it in terms of its omnipresence. They start seeing it everywhere and realize that most other white people are not seeing what they see. Because of this insight, they will suddenly see a difference between themselves and those whites not aware of the tacit racism around them. This is the double consciousness they need to have.
There's the mic.
Yeah, you also have to get your thing up.
All right, so my section of the talk deals with another part of the book that looks at, the type of racism that upwardly mobile, upper middle class and middle class Black Americans, and in this case, particularly men, experience in the workplace. I'm not going to use the clicker. Here, I'm going to lay out an argument of explaining how race as an interaction order works for upper middle class Black Americans, how there can be two different definitions of the situation and these trust conditions that are requirements for interactions for there to be a mutual understanding. And what happens when your presentation of self isn't taken for granted, and how the fracturing, the presentation of self that you present is not recognized. Now, before I get started, and I'm going to do, because I want to have time for questioning, I'm going to condense this talk a bit. But I think this is really important that I lay out a few things ahead of time. That we've been in a number of situations where we both witness my presentation of self not being reified. And that when I found myself in situations where either my credentials were being questioned, or if there were people who I thought were trying to discredit or sort of ruin my presentation, I sort of did not feed into that interaction. I knew that the presentation of self that I was presenting was not the presentation of self that I was getting back. And because I've been in this situation before, I know that something was amiss. And so I started talking to over 60 high-level Black executives and asking them, is this something that you've experienced in your everyday life? And when I say high-level Black executives, lawyers, judges, doctors, vice presidents of corporations, newspaper bureau chiefs, that most of these men explain that they've witnessed this phenomenon. And while I will say that it is something that we all experience, I think there are certain thresholds for people where it happens more to some as opposed to others. And so I wanted to, go in depth and talk to just 9 men who were almost ideal types of the type of racism that Black executives experience in everyday life. And a number of experiences that they talked about was, not being recognized in their places of work and being mistaken for someone else. Being sexualized and having comments made constantly about their appearance and their bodies. Not being responded to as having authority. So people going over and contacting your supervisor to check to make sure that those were the orders that the person who's in a position of power over the person, the Black person in this case, actually said what the person who's the vice president in this case of this company that I'm going to use on this tape actually said what he said. And then having their statements questioned. That whatever knowledge they had, that it's always being met with suspicion. And so these were some of the experiences that Black Americans talked about. I want to say this, and this part of the talk is very theoretical, Our thesis is simply this. If one makes a presentation of self and does not receive the expected response, then one's self-reflection becomes fractured. That reflection of the self by the other that is essential for a successful interaction to occur. As such, that the interaction itself is fractured, but what's required is sort of trust. And if you can think about trust as sort of mutual understandings, but that we're on the same page with regards to this interaction. And this creates problems because sense-making is complicated. And so things that should be mutually intelligible, when those things don't happen, we start to speculate. So when my presentation of self is not reified, or there's some type of trouble in their interaction, we fall back to motives. Oh, that must be about race, that must be about class, this person must not like me, this person is trying to discredit me. All I can tell you is this, that there's trouble in that interaction. And one of the things that, although there's trouble in that interaction, that certain people experience this trouble more than others. And then the question becomes, what actually happened? What's actually going on? Now, for those of you, some of you may be sociology majors, but W.I. Thomas and Dorothy Swain Thomas came up with an argument called the definition of the situation. And the definition of the situation and the presentation of self are mutually constitutive of each other. That if you find yourself, that there's nothing that we do that isn't situated action. And so when we find ourselves in situations where we are supposed to share a definition of a situation, we're all here for a lecture about race. We're all here to understand what's going on. But if I start talking about something that's unrelated to the topic in that particular context, there's something problematic or off about that interaction. And I think a lot of times that people in various situations are doing things that they take for granted that's unconscious. And so when we're working with the same definition of the situation, we can mutually understand each other. But when we're coming in and we're assuming motives that's attached to a person, especially if the person, you assume that that person is somewhere that that shouldn't be, then that question raises about, not only motives, but also authenticity and competency of that person. So if you're accustomed to not seeing a quote-unquote I'm a black professor in a position of power, how those questions of my identity and whether I'm qualified and whether I should be in this space, how those things come up. And that there can be various different definitions of the situation because you're taking for granted that I'm not supposed to be here. And so you're trying to rectify, the presentation of self and what you're taking for granted. Now, we build on this idea of what we call the fractured reflection in the presentation of self. And we use Joe Fagan's white racial frame to show that shared tacit beliefs that make it difficult for Black Americans to print selves and identities that do not conform to normative expectations about such identities. So again, this whole argument about who's able to do what and when is essential and is extremely important. Harold Garfinkel. For those of you at CMU, Herb Simon is a popular figure. But Harold Garfinkel was a contemporary of Herb Simon, and they actually communicated about looking at how information is transformed. Also, they had a number of letter exchanges. Harold Garfinkel identifies the trust condition. And meaning that, if there are people you trust in the interaction, it leads to meaningful understandings. But he points out that when trust conditions are satisfied, parties agree on the meanings of their actions. But divisions and inequalities between people prevent them from being able to fully commit to requirements of interactions. Cooperation to have coordinated action, but also reciprocity, making it impossible for them to make sense of the situation and the self together. Now, where does this come from and why the threshold is important? In 1952, in his dissertation at Harvard, Garfinkel found that upwardly mobile Jewish pre-medical students with a strong role identification would suffer the greatest degree of anxiety when the interviewer did not confirm their definition of the situation. In this case, the assessment of fellow med student hopefuls. When the self of the role identification was not confirmed, minority participants suffered more than others. Now, this adds insights to that, again, everybody experiences this, but there is a threshold. not only is there more fracturing going on, in this case for black males, but their marginality makes the incident even more damaging, making evasive actions, literally trying to get out of that situation with yourself intact, extremely important. So structural and interactional factors intersect to produce a form of interactional violence that black men routinely experience. For the sake of time, I'm going to present one case. And it's a vice president of a marketing company, and he's talking about sort of the tacit unconscious racism that he experienced in his everyday life and how his authority is being questioned. So he knows what the normal response is. Now, on the screen, you're going to see the transcripts flash as he's talking. So they're a bit off because I did this rather quickly, but I'm going to get started just with the first account. This is horrible. Is there a way to?
Yes, we have to do it
on the computer. I'm sorry.
desktop. It's over here. Yeah, push.
I touched the screen.
Sorry. Anyway,
Sorry. We found it.
It's a touch screen, and I keep touching.
All right. And we were told, never touch the screen. Don't you ever touch it. Bad things will happen. All right, let's see. Here we go now. So this idea of, and it was what a number of our participants call double checks. This idea that you administer an order or you go through and you give, you're just simply doing your job. And to have your, to have go above your head and have the supervisor check on you. Now, there's another account that we want to think about the significance of trust. Now, this idea of trust is really essential in interaction. That for us to have meaningful interactions, the trust condition is required. And so what happens if you're in a workplace and you don't trust your colleagues? What types of meaningful interactions do you have in that context? I'm going to play this clip. Going farther there. If there are people who come to you and you give them directions, you give them orders, how does that work in terms of trust? You see what I'm saying? I'm going to play the last clip and then I'm going to wrap up. But one of the things that I want to stress is that although this may seem like this happens in black-white interactions, the way that anti-blackness works, that anyone can get in on this. And so anyone can question your credentials, anyone can question your authority, and he lays out this argument that I think is extremely sophisticated in terms of how he navigates a world where he's doing and running into these types of interactions all the time, where it may happen infrequently for some of us, but it becomes a part of his daily existence as the VP of this company.
Has a person of color ever behaved in this regard towards you? And how oh, I'm sorry.
It caused me to wonder, I began to wonder, okay, is it me? Am I emitting some kind of persona that would cause one to have to second guess me? Am I coming off arrogant? Am I coming off in without self-confidence? What is it that's causing this to be the case? And I have talked to other people about this. I've talked to others and they said, no, that's not it. That a good number of people of color, because they want to be, they want to be celebrated by the institution. They take on these same kinds of characteristics as white folk about other black people. So they can't wonder if it was me, and they would say, no, you can understand that black person does every other black person the same way. And they begin to cite stories and scenarios where this black person is a lot of people's authority.
I'm going to wrap up my section by saying the self presented by black males is often reflected back to them in a form they do not recognize as themselves. This is our primary phenomena that we explore. Achieving a stable social self in interactions entails counting on others to respond to you in the expected way, to confirm the self you present. One failure does not prevent the self from being able to take this process for granted on other occasions. However, there is a threshold past trust relations and the assumptions of reciprocity fail. And why this is significant. It's important that we assume that, that certain segments of the population are not having experiences with unconscious racism. And I think this sort of captures sort of the element of a particular group. And the reason we use men, and in some cases we use all women in other cases, is to sort of highlight how there's a gendered element to this as well. And I think this is important, and I think this is significant. So I'm going to stop there, and we're going to take questions. How long should we take questions, given?
At this time, about 20 minutes, and I think that'll be about right.
So, all right. So let's just take some questions and stop here. You don't have to, but you should. Also, I just want to say one thing. The people in the history department have been exceptionally gracious and kind to me. For those of you who came here, I really appreciate you. And thank you for that lovely note. Also to the people at CMU, Mom for Two has just been lovely to me as well, who's not in the history department, but she's one of my good friends and partners in crime. And my other friends who came out, I appreciate you guys. Let's take questions. Don't be shy.
That was about the painting.
Oh, yes. So, I think we were talking about sort of fractured reflections. And if you look at the painting, there's one image that's upside down, there's another one that looks like a white image, and so it's like once it goes through the black figure, it becomes sort of gray and distorted. And I thought that sort of summarized a lot of the arguments that we're making in the book, like what happens when you're not recognized as a human being all the time, and how you have this gaze that's coming at you, but you end up with something totally off in the end. So.
Yes.
I also want to add something to the end of the fractured reflections argument, which I think is really important. Because what Waverly is describing is you make the presentation itself, but people see somebody else. So the reflection you get back is not you. How I noticed it, and how it had, ended up coming to our attention and becoming a paper, is because when that happened, Waverly acted like he didn't hear it. He was being asked a question, he didn't answer it. Now, we were in a public forum, and there were a lot of famous people there, and he kept getting asked questions saying he refused to answer. So afterwards I said, what's wrong with you, right? What's wrong? And he said, I didn't trust him, I wouldn't answer. So one of the important things that we developed in this paper is that high status black men are surviving with their selves intact by refusing to acknowledge that this is happening, right? It's what we call a non-response. It's because otherwise, without saying that, it seems like, there's all this damage happening, and, there's a shield.
And sometimes, there was that incident, and there was another one by a well-known scholar. Now, I'm a postdoc at Yale. There's no affirmative action for postdocs. There are no minority supplements. It was a traditional postdoc, but this scholar said to me, are you at Yale on a minority fellowship? And
It was even worse than that. It was up on the board, Waverly Duck, Yale University. She walked up and said, hi, I'm so-and-so. You must be on one of those minority fellowships. So again, and
then
then,
I did respond, and I just looked and walked away.
yeah. So it's this non-response to the fractured reflection. Yeah.
Okay, I'm wondering about how one becomes aware. Black people even become aware of the unspoken. Because, in the conversation during our break, we came up with instances that we would never have mentioned. And so I don't know, outside this classroom, how, it seems like an impossible task.
Well, when I have classes, I'm in a university with very few black students, but they come into the class because that's what I'm teaching. So I'll have, 10 or 15 out of 30, so sometimes half. They know, they can tell these stories. They know it's been happening. They don't realize that it's happening quite the same way to everybody else. So it's what you described. So they do have a sense of their own, hearing this, and what they say is, I'm not sure that's racist, right? I had one come to me after she'd been in class for a while, and she'd gone to the help center to get her computer fixed. And she'd been told, no, we can't do that. By a white female student who was there, who just sort of blew her off. And she said, but it's exam week, and of course they can fix her computer. So she came to me, I was at a meeting, I think about race relations actually, and she came and said, I don't know what to do. I'm not sure whether this is racist or not. And she described it to me, and I said, hell yes it is. And I went over to her, with her to the computer center, and we got the person who told her that it couldn't be fixed to come out. And I said, I want this fixed. And she said, well, she didn't tell me she needed it fixed, right? So yeah, you're right. Knowing things are happening, but not being, is this racist? I'm not sure it's racist. So the white kids don't even know what's happening. They're hearing it all day long and not hearing it. The black kids are hearing it, but they're not really sure, right? How upset should they be about it? What should they be doing?
I was taking notes when you talked about interaction order. Could you define that for me again? Give the example. I understand that before I make another comment.
Oh yeah. So interaction orders are things that are mutually understood, shared understandings that are contextually and situationally understood. And they also include sanctioned and rewarded practices. So it's just a way of interacting. And so there are shared expectations. There's a trust agreement. And again, the context and the situation is extremely important. And sometimes there are sanctions and sometimes there are rewarded practices.
I'm going to give a very simple answer. It's a sort of a garbled answer. If you imagine that social practices, you know, like greeting, hello, how are you, and what your response is, has rules to it. There's a thing I'm supposed to do, you will hear as a greeting. There's a thing I'm expecting you to do. He used a tic-tac-toe game, and he said, okay, so, you know, one person goes like that, and one person goes like that, and then what if the next move is this, right? And so the idea is that when the expectations can be violated in such a way that the game is broken. And one of the things I found in some of the early research was with simple things like greetings. White people like to do, you know, I'm so-and-so, you know, who are you? I work here, where do you work? I have my PhD from, you know, so-and-so, you know, where is yours from? And it's a question, answer, question, answer. Now, you know, within a couple of minutes, they can be doing where they're, you know, married, what house they have, where they live, how much money they earn, right? How many kids they have. When I was talking with both students and wealthy middle-class Black Americans who lived in a wealthy white suburb, and I say that to say it's crossing class boundaries, they don't do that. And so what do they say they do? They say that being asked all those questions makes them feel like they're being treated like they're not a human being. Why isn't it good enough that I'm here? And as a white person, I was bewildered. What? Right? I mean, how can I talk to you if I don't ask you questions? And even when I role play this now, I still can't do it. I always start asking questions. But they say you volunteer information about things you can see that are relevant to the situation. And so eventually this idea developed that personal information is being protected, which makes sense, right? You have people who are being discriminated against, very likely to be unemployed because people won't hire you, very likely to have a prison record or some kind of legal record because of mass incarceration. And so on. So protecting of information that creates the possibility of equality. So, you know, a person who's not doing well can be in a place with a person who is doing well, and the status doesn't get immediately exposed. And I can remember arguing with my students, I'm not doing anything wrong. And they said, yeah, well, what happens when you ask a few questions and discover you're talking to the janitor? You keep talking? Oops, right? You know, so over the years, you know, I learned a lot about how my own practices were hierarchically and competitively oriented.
And one of the things that this is, you know, why she did the tic-tac-toe game, because the rules are so taken for granted. And so when that violation occurs, I mean, it's off-putting. Nobody discussed that we all are going to do X's and O's in a certain place. We just all know the rules. And the chapter that she's talking about is the first chapter of the book. So we had a group of white women who self-identified as white, a group of women who self-identified as Black. And so when the white women got together, it was where do you live, what school do you go to, blah, blah, you know, these very status-conscious questions. And then the Black group was very topical. I wonder why we're here. What's the weather like? I wonder what's coming on TV tonight. And then when the groups got together, that's when, you know, Black people are rude, white people are nosy, those accounts start to come up.
And I've had lots of Black participants. You know, I've done it for alumni clubs and in the community. And they'll tell stories like, oh, when I was at my job, they had a retreat, you know, and I thought it was going to be great. And then they got me in the car, and once they had me surrounded, they started asking me questions, and I realized the retreat was just to interrogate me. You know, and so just
So you know, I think that I'm a Black female.
Yes.
So and you know, I have some of these experiences at work, and they aren't blatant, but I can feel them. Okay. So I'm listening to everything you're saying, but I have to go to work. I'm an executive, I have a job, so I'm how am I supposed to respond? I can't be angry, I can't say anything, because I have to keep my job and interact with leadership, right?
Yep.
So,
Are you asking what to do, or?
well, what are you saying? I mean,
First of
I'm
all,
fractured. You're fractured anytime you go into a situation like that.
I think one of the things that what we're trying to do is showing how this undermines our democratic process, how this undermines democracy in general. But on another level, was trying to figure out strategies that people in positions like you, what are some of the things that they're doing just to survive being in those spaces? So the non-response is one of the strategies that people use. Avoiding people who you don't trust and you put in a provisional box to have as many limited interactions as possible. And then again, sort of figuring out ways of simply when you hear racist statements, you just simply say, what do you mean by that? Too much diversity? Oh, I'm tired. It's something recently. I'm sick and tired of talking about diversity. What do you mean by that? You're on a minority supplement? No, but what do you mean by that? And so it becomes a way of having the person explain these things that, that feeling that you have. And the reason I speculate that you have that feeling is because you've watched how other people navigate these situations, and you're saying that the rules are somehow exceptional for you. And that allows it to be even more visible. And so I must say that, yes, your job, or just use myself as an example. My job allows me to do, community service that's important to me, to give talks, to write letters of recommendation, to, be on other people's tenure cases, to have these wonderful lectures. But it's something, by my sheer existence, it's something I deal with on a daily basis at work that you can hear about.
Oh, God, yeah. But what you can do is limited, that. You need the people you work with to understand the problem they're giving you, right? And that's where I started developing this. There's got to be a way of helping white people to understand what they don't understand about what they're doing, like to you, to Waverly. And in most cases, they really don't have any idea.
I have a question for, as far as white people having to be in situations with other white folks, and they hear something, and they have to confront that. What's the feedback you're hearing from white people? Particularly, what's happening among family members,
Happens all the time.
where it counts the most. You hear the always the scenario, I have an old uncle that's racist, or a grandfather that's. So are they willing to confront?
Well, first they have to hear it. I mean, the old uncle, yeah, they know about it. But it's really going on a lot more than that. So first they have to hear it. And no, they're not willing to confront. So that's why we have the what do you mean by that, right? And that's working.
My question is, those that do confront,
Yeah.
what are they finding? What happens to their social
Well, the
network?
confrontation is, what do you mean by that? Did you just say that? What did you mean by what you said? It is confrontation, but it asks them to take another turn. So somebody will say something, and maybe it was racist, maybe it wasn't, you're not sure, and you say, what do you mean by that? Now, you heard it in the Black People Stink, right? They just dig themselves deeper and deeper into a hole. And if you try to confront them on the first thing, you shouldn't have said that, that's terrible, then they're gonna pretend it wasn't. If you say, what did you mean by that, and they dig themselves farther and farther into a hole, you don't even need to say anything.
So
It's
what is
like, oh
the
my God.
effect socially for them? In other words, just like the black male that
Yeah.
has to, or as she just stated,
Right.
she has to keep her job, so she has to
Yeah.
find this
Yeah.
space to keep going.
Yeah.
What are the effects of the social network for the white person that does want to confront racism when they're just amongst white folks?
Well, they start finding themselves, as I said at the end, not like their friends. I had one of my white students, he came running up to me one day and said, oh my God, I was just at the Xerox machine. I was sitting there with two white friends, and they're making Xeroxes, and they get a little black spot on the Xerox as it comes out of the machine, and they turn to each other and say, a black thing, aren't black things supposed to be big? Like, because it's a little black thing. And he said, oh my God, I heard it. What are they doing? And I told them it wasn't funny, you know, but it's very hard. They don't hear it. And so the good thing about that is that the white people who do that start suffering and seeing, and they become very proactive about trying to do something about it. And since it's white people doing this and absorbing it and amplifying it, if they can't start hearing it, you know, then I don't see a solution.
And the other thing is the racial boomerang that comes back. So simply by pointing out the racism that's taking place, how it's redirected at you that you're the racist. You know, the student who says, I didn't make the statement that black people stink, but I have a diversity problem because I don't know that black people stink. And so it's a way of gaslighting, making you, because you made the account, that it's your problem, that it's something that you're doing wrong versus the problematic situation. And this is where, what do you mean by that, becomes really a powerful tool to sort of simply ask the person to explain, what do you mean by that statement?
And these kids really become politicized by the reactions that they're getting.
You had a second
Yeah,
part of
I'm
the
listening
question.
to another lens.
Yeah.
At the neurological level, what I'm perceiving is that a high status black talking to a high status white. At the level of the brain, it activates a threat reaction. At that level, the brain interprets that as a threat response. Either I'm going to be annihilated or become less than. And becoming less than in a status hierarchy is a threat reaction at the level of the brain. The other one connected to what do whites say in the context of the white conversation, it's just the us and them dynamic. If I'm an us talking about them, and if I take up a role on behalf of them, then I become a them. So that activates a threat reaction too at the level of brain. So that's in the mix as well, is what you're.
Yeah, and
Interaction orders
as
well.
long as the interaction orders in the brain are working on these two separate things, right, then we've got this problem. So one of the things that's happening when white kids start to hear it is they're making a shift. They don't become black, but they become aware in a way that horrifies them, you know, and then they can have conversations with their black classmates that they couldn't have at the beginning, because suddenly they don't hear it all as playing the race card, right? They realize it's real, and now they want to know more about what they can do.
The horror has to do with the brain thinking, I'm going to be annihilated or die.
Yeah,
So
except
that's a non-conscious level.
yeah, it's all of this is non-conscious, right? Except what's happening in some of these high-status executive examples is they're giving orders. I assume this is happening with you. People are refusing, you know, to do the work because why? Well, I wasn't sure you were right when you told me to do that, right? You know, so there are real practical consequences in trying to get that job done because people can't recognize that they're competent, you know, to have that authority. There are two over here, and then we'll go to you.
I like what you say about the what do you mean, but how should we as students educate our generation whenever we encounter a situation like that?
Well, I think of what do you mean as a way of educating, right? That when you think you hear something, you force the person to answer you. Otherwise, you've called them out and you're on the defensive because they're going to attack you. So if you say, what did you mean by that? Or did you just say that? You're forcing them to answer you. And you can keep questioning them as they explain. And as you'll notice with some of these observations, the explanations just dig them in deeper and deeper and deeper, and they make it clearer and clearer to you. Share them with people. Talk about it. We need to have this conversation.
It was that way with you.
And then somebody here.
Actually, what I have is more like a comment than really a question. So I'm black. I'm from France. I'm black French, and these issues that you have talked about is things that I mean, I just saw my life flash, and this is my point. And I just felt like I was attending some of the meetings that I attend here with, Black students once a month, and all the issues that every student go through as a CMU student, adding to that the insecurities of knowing that either your classmates or your professors have doubt about your intellectual ability about attending the school. And what I realized, especially when we were just talking about that at the break, when we have upper level students, either seniors or graduate students, telling them, how you grow this big, CMU skin, this thing that yours is thicker. Because on top of growing that thick skin of being a CMU student, you have to grow through this. So don't let it eat you, but let it make something that will help you in your professional career. And what I was thinking while I was, thinking about what you're trying to do, let's have society, not just us, because these are meetings that we have with us. So we need society to know that, we need to point out these instances of everyday racism that are happening, is that I grew up like this. I've always been either the youngest or the only Black person wherever I was, and my mom just taught me to have these, it's not pink-colored glasses, but just ignore these things that are happening every day, because otherwise you will fight 10 times a day. And you can't let that happen because there's only 24 hours in a day. You need to write this paper, and you need to make sure that you make an A in this paper. And I realize that I'm raising my sons to be the same, to ignore what people are saying, and just make sure that whatever you do it more because people are waiting at the corner. And one thing that I am really excited about your research is that it's helping other people see what we're going through, but at the same time, I'm afraid to let go of that because that's what's helped me keep afloat, and that's how I'm raising my children. And I'm just waiting to see when is society going to be ready, when I'll be able to maybe tell my daughter who was just born that it's okay not to be like your brothers because society is, So it's a defense mechanism that we integrated, that we're passing on to our children, and I don't see if I can let go. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yes.
When can we let go? So it's not really a question, it's more a comment.
And it's a thing I said at the end of my talk, that's why, this idea of if only Black people would act like white people, assimilation, you can't let go, you can't stop. It is your protection. But one other thing that I said, that in developing this protection, you're articulating the thick skin, which, negative side of it. There are some really wonderful democratic things that have been produced by this. And so I think when society gets to, where we hope it's going to get, we will have learned a lot from the Black interaction work. It's not just getting rid of the problems and then, there are things that you no longer have to do. There are things that white people are going to have to learn from Black people that they're going to need to start doing in order to make this work.
There are companies that have diversity workshops for their employees, which they have to attend on a regular basis. Does this help?
I developed it many years ago after attending a few of those because they don't work and they piss people off. White people get really pissed. So I have actually done this as a diversity training a couple of times, and it does work. I did it at the VA hospital in Detroit for a student of mine who was a VA nurse there. And they'd had diversity trainings before, and the administrators didn't want to do it. And she had to promise them that they didn't have to be in the room. It was weird. So, I had a few people in the room, a couple of doctors and nurses, but the top people were sitting in the other room. They could hear, but they weren't forced to be there. And as we started talking, they inched their chairs, closer, and eventually ended up inside the room. Because it's not threatening, right? It's somehow, I'm not quite sure why, the way it's usually done is threatening. So yes, it does work.
Yes.
Yes. Dr. Franklin Pierce, a Harvard psychiatrist, did some studies many years ago, and he talked about the fact that Blackness has been stigmatized as part of the DNA of this culture, and therefore African Americans on a 24/7 basis, 365 days out of the year, are constantly dealing with microaggressions of white people. We We all have a different defense mechanism relative to how we act. For an example, passing up of a cab, having your credentials being questioned, a whole multitude of things like that. Dr. Franklin Pierce, one of the things he pointed out is that eventually it takes on many other different pathologies. We saw rebellions in 67 and 68. We saw that play out as a response, and when they tried to trap Dr. King into making very despicable comments about African Americans in the streets who were burning and looting and doing all sorts of things, King, who really had a knack for placing the context of the black struggle in the proper perspective, said, those are crimes, the Negro loots and the Negro burns. The Negro, he said, those are contestable crimes, but those are crimes born out of white racism of the larger society. So all that's contextualized in terms of how we constantly react to the microaggressions of white people. We have different defense mechanisms as to how we do react. And as pointed out here, Richard Fagan's done a lot of great work as far as in white racist framing and everything like that. His research has been very good.
Sometimes we can get a serious lesson through, particularly people outside of this room, through the media and humor. And I'm thinking in terms of the movie Get Out, where things are kind of reversed and people get to see each other from different perspectives. And in laughing so often, you can learn because you're there in. And it's inside. Now the question. What's the percentage of black students that get
I'm just gonna speculate. This is pure speculation, but somebody in the room. But I think for Pitt, it's around 4 to 5%. And CMU, I think it's like, is it 3? I just said 3%. Yes. And then
I was just thinking about, on the topic of the fractured reflection, I was thinking of how early that happens in a black person's life. You know, how early you're walking into a store and being followed at having, a young black child being considered older, all the ways being perceived as threatening. So how often, how awful when you're the adult and have all these credentials, have paid all these dues to still have that experience.
I'm going to tell a story. I'm going to make a statement that something my mom said when I left Detroit, and then I'm going to give you this silver lining about this. So I get accepted to the school called Connecticut College, and for those of you, Detroit is a predominantly black school. You know, when I was growing up, I had black school teachers, black principal, black mayor, everything was black. There was a few white folks around, and Detroit was all like. And my mother, she sat me down, and she said, the black part of town will always be considered to be the bad part of town. And matter of fact, any black space will always be considered less than good. But don't believe what people say because they don't know what they're talking about because they've never been there. Why this statement is significant is because there is this sort of silver lining about doing this work. That, one of the main benefits of racism is that I can see all these rules that are in place that don't necessarily apply to me. And when I say don't necessarily apply to me, I can see that there are situations that I'll walk into, and because I can't easily participate in that situation, I can see how its inner workings and how it's structured. Which, and there's another part about racism is that there's something very lazy about it. And so once you start seeing the structures and how it's playing out, and once you also start assuming that, whether it's the continent of Africa, or whether it's a black neighborhood or a predominantly black city, Detroit for this instance, you start to get a sense of that these are statements that are being taken for granted, that people are saying who have never been to Detroit a day in their life, have never seen all the fantastic or modern things that from Freetown in Sierra Leone to Lagos in Nigeria, that there's so much that we just don't know. And so I think, that there's something about being young because you take for granted that the world is this very egalitarian place. And so when you step out of that situation and you experience racism, it's very jarring and it's very disorienting. And if you don't have the proper strategies or tactics to deal with it, it can be extremely problematic.
Right. And one of the reasons that we would both argue that Garfinkel fits so well with what we're doing is that what he said was, it's very difficult to see this invisible, unconscious stuff that's happening around you. He made a famous argument about a transgender person in 1959. He said being transgender is like being a natural experiment, right? Because everything she did, she had to be more aware than other people of what she was doing. And while, the black students I've worked with don't always know exactly what's going on, they always know something is going on, and the white students never have a clue. So there's something about this experience that can open, what do I want to say, open awareness up, even though it's, got this hugely negative side. And the question is how to use that with the research, to get white people to begin to, have some idea about what this experience is.
I want to play off something that Sandra said, remarking on this earlier period, very explosive, very violent kind of development. And I want you guys to just reflect for a minute, about how optimistic you are that we are at a moment where this kind of explosion is, in your view, not likely, or in your view, likely. Because this is an expression of, it's a class issue, so much of what you're saying, sort of professionals having these kind of issues, but when you talk about the grassroots, what kind of issues are they having by comparison? And I think this is what your comment was speaking to, that more massive, interactions that are going on at the base. So could you just talk about what your sense is?
I think right now racism is the biggest national security threat that the United States faces. To the extent that white people understand that, it's not like 67, 68. So when I watched the March for Our Lives, they seem to understand that this is a problem that white kids have, that the racism white kids have to take responsibility for. Insofar as white Americans understand that they're going to lose their democracy if they don't deal with this race problem, then this is not a problem that black Americans are being left alone to solve. Now, how optimistic about that, I don't know, because we're pretty close to losing our democracy right now. I mean, no matter what we do, it may be too late. But I do see more and more white people beginning to understand, oh my God, we came this close to losing it. And that the divisiveness that's being exploited by foreign nations and, the conservative right is racism. So we can solve that problem, then, the divisions go away and we can't be exploited.
I think the reason why we work so hard and we have a number of arguments is because we truly believe in democracy and making things better for everyone. And I think for me, and just giving a personal account, whenever I leave the U.S., I realize how American I am and how much I have in common with regards to my history, regards to a lot of the things I take for granted. I realize how I have a lot of those things in common with other Americans, both white and non-white Americans. But I also, and one of the things that I really appreciate about being a Black American is that I'm also able to sympathize and empathize and put myself in in somebody else's shoes. And this is why the argument about whites developing a double consciousness is so essential and so important. Because unless that happens, I don't think we can go any further. And I think that's one of the more significant things about the book that I think that we're proposing. I think we both, if we were not naturally optimistic that things could get better, I don't think we would be doing this work. But we are very concerned as well. And I think that's the whole point of this book. That this is a book about democracy. And it's a book about race. And it's a book about American history. But we're really concerned about what's happening at this moment in time in this country. And that's why we're doing this work.
Okay, I want to thank Waverly and Ann for their